All right, everybody. Welcome to a Common Sense reading series. Uh, today, we're welcoming in our readers, Ariel Francisco and Sarah Miner. For anyone who is attending the series for the first time, I'm Jordan Stempelman. I started this series in Kansas City, Missouri in 2011. The fall since the pandemic has been in person, and then the spring has been remote. I've archived past readings, though, on my website. So I'm going to put in the link or in the chat, I should say, a link to that. So you can check those out. They're really great. And then following today's reading, there will be a brief Q&A. So you can post any questions that you may have for today's readers in the chat, and I'll be sure to ask those on your behalf. And of course, if the writers have any questions for one another, that's always enthusiastically welcomed. I'll keep an eye on people getting into the reading a little late, and so I'll make sure to let people in. But let's welcome the first reader. Ariel Francisco is the author of four poetry collections. Most recently, All the Places We Love Have Been Left in Ruins, and the translator of various poetry collections from Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, the Dominican Republic, Guatemala, and Haiti. Born in the Bronx to Dominican and Guatemalan parents and raised in Miami, his work has been published in the New Yorker, American Poetry Review, Academy of American Poets, Poetry Magazine, the New York City Ballet, Latino Book Review, and elsewhere. He is assistant professor of poetry and Hispanic studies at Louisiana State University. And please welcome Ariel.
Thank you so much, Jordan. Happy to be here. Thank you for having me. Thank you, everyone, for coming out virtually. And also, shout out to whoever had the camera on their cat earlier. Always love to see that. And thank you to Sarah as well. Excited to read with you. I'm just going to read seven poems for you guys, two from my recent book, and then five from a current manuscript in progress. Um, the first poem is called "Even Churchill's is Closing." It's a sort of elegy for this punk bar venue that used to exist in Miami that had been around since like the 70s or 80s, and it closed during the pandemic, like a lot of places, and is yet to reopen. And someone very cruelly, as a prank, one day put up a sign that said "Chili's opening soon" on the front, which I absolutely fell for. But is the kind of thing that would happen in Miami to turn this very iconic place into no offense to people who like Chili's, but you know. Um, so it's called Even Churchill's is Closing. Yes, named after a war criminal. Yes, his ugly mug adorned the entryway, but still we defied his baby face scowl with our dancing, our sweat misting the air, someone circling and stomping until they were vomiting in the bathroom that looked like it was clean maybe once every presidential term, re-elections not included, watching the Jacuzzi Boys or Radio Boxer or some other flicker of light that carried us through yet another night of rum and cokes and the cheapest beer imaginable, keeping the rest of the world at bay by singing at the top of our young lungs until our voices ghosted us and our limbs wobbled like jello shots as we staggered into that incoherent darkness, bracing itself to be smothered by dawn. As we staggered out like wounded soldiers, arms around shoulders, holding each other up in the gravel that passes for a parking lot where the man in his reflective vest, who we paid $5 to watch our car from potential thieves, including him, salutes us with a smile bright as sunrise. And the second poem, this one's a little shorter. The second poem I'll read from this collection, it gets its title from a news headline that I saw in a science magazine. So presumably it's true. I didn't double check with them. Uh, but this is called After Reading That Scientists Want to Use AI to Decipher Whale Language. What good will it do to transcribe the lyrics of their music, their mournful earth elegies, upload it to Spotify and deliver them their residuals of penny fractions? Anything can be monetized, even the whales of whales. So many human voices go unheard, muted, buried in rubble, drowned and drowning. artificial intelligence, artificial empathy. When the whales start a climate change podcast, science will pull the plug. And this next one, so these are, so forgive me if I'm kind of turned this way. Now I'm reading from my computer screen. Um, This first one is another sort of Florida poem, and I don't know where y'all are from across these kind of this internet space. But growing up in Florida, we used to catch these small little lizards, and they would get very upset, and they would like kind of bite down on anything. So we used to let them bite down on different parts of our faces, and we would just kind of walk around with with lizards hanging from our heads. So this is called Young Lizard Kings. Under the Florida sun's stern gaze, parents too busy fighting to watch us in the yard, my brother and I hunt for lizards in the loquat trees, brimming with many suns, chase them skittering across the porch or through the tall grass. If you pinch their tail, it snaps off and they shoot into the foliage like a bottle rocket. You have to grab them by the middle with thumb and forefinger like a cigarette, their little mouths open in rage or fear, baring tiny, harmless teeth at us. We raise them as though offering them to the sun before offering them our earlobes and lower lip, letting them clamp down in rage or fear, and wear them as living jewelry, breathing green gems clinging to our skulls. We roam the neighborhood like this, little deformed Maya deities, young lizard kings, our providence adorning our faces, seeking to remake this world. And this next one, I'm not sure if there's much to say. This is just kind of based on an anecdote from my dad, which if you're familiar with me or my poetry, that's often a source of where a lot of it comes from. Um, is there anything you need to know? I don't think so. This is called My Dad Applies for Citizenship and is Accused of Being a Communist, 1997. And my dad, he immigrated from the Dominican Republic in 1979, but he had a lot of feelings about getting his citizenship. He kind of felt like he was abandoning his homeland. So when he finally got it, it was kind of about that. My dad applies for citizenship and is accused of being a communist, 1997. 20 years after arrival, the burden of betraying his homeland finally gone, or at least dulled down to a manageable pain tucked deep. But the government has questions. Why is he a member of Casa de las Americas, New York, supporters of the Cuban Revolution? Why does he get newspapers from Cuba and the Sandinistas in Nicaragua and the US's own Socialist Party? They ask what he talks about on his radio show. If they searched his home, the framed photo of Che in the foyer, hanging like a holy relic, would answer all their questions. But my dad just shrugs and says he's a writer and a journalist and likes to read, shows them his framed associate's degree from Hostos Community College, smudging the glass when he points to the word journalism, hoping he's masked his patronizing tone as pride. He says, I've received such a great education in this country. He says, I've learned so much about the US you wouldn't believe. Uh, Here, just scrolling a little bit. Sorry, just got the whole manuscript open here. This next one, so both my parents are kind of odd, and they have their various beliefs and interests. So my dad's from the Dominican Republic, my mom's from Guatemala, um, and one of my mom's, like some people have the TV on all the time. And one of the channels she always has on is the History Channel, which, if you've watched it over the last 20 years, has nothing to do with history. So that's a long way of saying that Ancient Aliens is often on at my mom's house, and I used to watch it as a kid. Um, and as a kid, I was obsessed with space. And my dad thought this was odd for some reason, so he did like his dad research. And he found out that I have the same birthday as Yuri Gagarin, who was the first person ever in outer space, the Russian cosmonaut. And that was the answer to the question for him. He's like, "Oh, they have the same birthday. That's why my kid loves outer space." So this is called Seeing a UFO and Singing Frank Sinatra's Fly Me to the Moon into the Night at the Top of My Lungs. How many poems does a guy have to write to get abducted by aliens? I know you see me, same as the fat moon peeping through the trees like a pervert. I just want to talk. My arms are sore from waving. My dad used to wonder why I was always so fascinated with space, then learned I share a birthday with Yuri Gagarin, and that explained everything. I would watch that shit show Ancient Aliens with my mom, and she would say, in Guatemala, we remember where the Mayas came from, raising her eyebrows into orbit. How could I not grow up to search the skies for meaning? Ancient people thought objects soaring through the atmosphere were celestial serpents, their glowing tails slithering through space, and I buy it. Quetzalcoatl, is that you? I feel like the last kid sitting in front of the school waiting to be picked up. Don't say you've forgotten about me. Uh, let's see. Oh, maybe I'll add this one too. Yeah, maybe I'll read eight. That's all right. I'm still within the time frame. So this poem, I was watching for the first time a few years ago, The Florida Project, which is a really awesome movie if you've ever seen it. And there's a still, it's not really a part of the movie, but there's a shot of like this souvenir shop. And it says Disney Gifts Outlet. And I swear to God, my mom used to work there, and I like captured a screenshot and sent it to her and confirmed. And it was just like this really bizarre moment because I hadn't seen the movie before, and I hadn't seen that place since I was like 7 or 8 maybe. But it was kind of a bizarre moment. So it's called On Seeing the Gift Shop my mom used to work at in the Florida Project. And forgive me if I stumble. I don't think I've read this one before. Poorly painted orcas splashing above the bold red lettering that reads Disney Gifts Outlet in that strange fringe of Orlando around International Drive. The shot lingers for only a moment, but immediately transports me to the back of my parents' Honda hatchback with my brother, my sister asleep in the front seat, my dad driving us to pick up my mom from work near midnight. The back seats flattened, we lay on our stomachs facing the back window, reenacting that scene from the Jurassic Park video game at Chuck E. Cheese we would spend all our tokens on, where the T Rex is hungrily chasing after you as the Jeep desperately drives away through the jungled path, and you have to stare it down, shooting your plastic gun to keep the beast at bay and save the injured Jeff Goldblum. We imagine we see the giant dinosaur in the flashing crevices of darkness between the highway streetlights, or pretend the high beams of the truck tailgating our slow little Honda are its carnivorous eyes glowing with hunger. We don't think about mom's 12-hour shift. We don't think about why she had to take this job selling glazed alligator skulls and ceramic orcas and trinkets worth less than the receipt paper their cost is printed on. We don't think about dad having to drive mom to work in the morning before driving us to school, before driving himself to work. We don't think about why we can't afford a second car like all our friends' parents. We don't think about anything except our own imagined struggle for survival, staring out at the darkness alive with our imagination, pointing our pretend weapons, defending ourselves against the night. And just two more for you guys. This next one, I was reading I was reading Martinez Spada, and I can't remember the poem off the top of my head, but he had some kind of metaphor about Evel Knievel, who I hadn't thought of in a long time. And I had this memory of watching Evel Knievel jump his motorcycle over the Grand Canyon, and I thought that can't be real. So I looked it up, and it was actually his son who did it. So it was a real thing I witnessed, and you can look it up. It's on YouTube. Um, his name is Robbie Knievel. No offense to Robbie Knievel, it is shockingly unimpressive. I didn't know the Grand Canyon was that narrow at that point. But this is kind of about that and about larger things as well. But this is called Watching Robbie Knievel Jump the Grand Canyon, 1999. My mom's first birthday post-divorce, duplex in the sidewalkless outskirts of Orlando. One TV for the four of us, one bathroom for the four of us, two bedrooms for the four of us. The frogs who made a home of the window AC cheer the daredevil on. You can make a home anywhere, I guess. We watch Robbie Knievel rev his motorcycle to achieve what his father could not, a second generation dream dressed all in white. We watch as he angels through the air, an inverse Icarus for a few seconds of flight, but a crash landing is still a landing, and a home is a home is a home. And So this will be the last poem. It's another shortish one. So thank you again for having me. Thank you again to everyone who came out. Um, this is another poem that's sort of spurred by just kind of random memories, and it lists a lot of. I don't know if everyone will get these references, but it lists a lot of game shows, and they make reference to a TV show, which I can't believe existed. I don't know if anyone remembers America's Most Wanted. Uh, but it was quite literally a show where they would just do like a countdown of the most wanted criminals in the country, and it's insane to think about now. So thank you again. This is called Remembering We Used to Sit Down Together as a Family to Watch America's Most Wanted. After The Price is Right and Wheel of Fortune, after Supermarket Sweep and the dream of having enough, it was time to turn the channel back to reality. A criminal countdown over dessert, trying to memorize the faces of serial killers and terrorists, kidnappers and con men, in case we spot them at Walmart or the bus stop or library. Before Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, before Y2K, before YouTube and content creators, we would watch in morbid curiosity how even the country's most sinister can dream of being on TV. Thank you.
That was great, Ariel. That was wonderful. I used to have a Evel Knievel toy as a kid.
That's awesome.
Big deal back then. Big deal. Um, why is it showing me this? I'll just push later to that notice. I don't need it. All right. So here we go. Our next reader will be Sarah Miner. Sarah is the author of Slim Confessions, The Universe as a Spider or Spit, Bright Archive, and The Persistence of the Bony Leg, annotated. Her work appears in places like the Kenyon Review, Fence, and Gulf Coast. She teaches in the University of Iowa's Nonfiction Writing MFA and serves as the video essay and cinepoetry section editor at Tri Quarterly Review. Please welcome Sarah Miner.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. Thank you, Jordan, for including us in this reading series, which I think is coming to an end. So I'm so honored to be part of it. And thanks to Ariel for that awesome reading. I loved thinking about Evel Knievel and gift shops and parking. I'm going to try reading from some new work today, which is always kind of um, scary, but also an interesting experiment that I think can make the work better while it's in process. So thanks for being with me along that ride. I'm going to read from a poem that has no visual material, which is unusual for me. And then I'm going to read from a very short piece that has a sort of animation that I'll share. And then I'm going to end by reading a short section of a book I have forthcoming next summer called Carousel. And I'll say a little bit before I do each of those things. So I'm just gonna share my screen and confirm that you folks can see. Yeah. Oh, Jordan.
Not yet. I haven't seen it yet.
Yeah, okay. Let's see. Good troubleshooting. Okay, here we go. I did do something fancy.
Oh, you did. Yeah. Oh, there we go.
Great.
Right.
Okay, I'm gonna start with a poem. This is called Woman Found Living in Grocery Store Sign. Still the house that light built vibrates with the measure of certain saints. Said she was hiding out from someone, said she was allergic to direct sun. News reports began by listing all the woman had possessed. A Keurig, said the cops, a printer and a desk. Slept up there a year, she said, but left the sign without incident. Green and agreeable, no need to huff puff. It was the contractor who found her out. Traced an orange cord to the hatch opposite family fare. The sign was hollow, 5 by 10, and drawn just like a house. a home icon zoned commercially, a little blood pillow for the bird's skinless breast. She had a house plant too, and who's to say they weren't family as advertised? All through winter's shortened distance, the sign had turned its face inward, one sheer wall where the pale sun rang through. The old children started out by licking the witch's little walls, sweetening up the gullet, the break in every shape's covenant. She, snoozing at the far precipice, she, angel of lumen warm flooring, the deep sour freezer, and the open mouthed drain, said she never peed inside the sign, but all the cops care is she won't say how she scaled it. Four spun sugar walls and the floor's tall shadow, backwards naming the first opponents to mutual aid. She left in a backpack, left a generator keen, official fingers tongue clean. Say, what's a vacancy if not the heaven of slow rotten food? The desk she climbed beside, the season's last hard freeze that arrived that night. How the light unwinds a room in May in Michigan. Sign signifier. No, my mistake. Signified sign. Okay, I'm going to read from a piece that has this little animation on screen. So if you're listening, that's great. If you can see your screen, that is also helpful. And I've been experimenting when I read this with sharing a bit of context either before or after I read the piece. And this time I'm going to share it before, and maybe it'll be interesting to think about that after you experience it. This is called The Lunette. That the blade grew dull. That women sat in the audience, knitting. That the king had been recognized for his head on a coin. That the inventor of the apparatus called it a humanitarian machine. That heads didn't roll, but were caught in a common bag. That in 1790, bob haircuts were in fashion for women. That French authorities claimed it reduced death to the blink of an eye. That the opening for the neck was called the lunette, after the crescent window. That the chemist Antoine Lavoisier suspected the human head could live on. That the bourgeoisie staged a macabre home theater called Cuisine Noire of blood pudding, beet salad, and coffee, where men wiped their hands on ladies' hair. That later, protesters erected a guillotine outside Jeff Bezos's $23 million home. That with the rest of the Academy of Sciences, the chemist Lavoisier lost his head to the weighty knife in May 1794. That the judge who sentenced Lavoisier, saying, "The revolution doesn't need scholars," was himself beheaded by August. That the headsman, a city servant, raised the head for all to see. That visibility is necessary in legal forms of putting to death. That the lunette became a vegan menstrual cup, a blinder, especially for a vicious horse, one half of a glass bull's eye watch face, and in its plural form, spectacles. That the blade worked like a shutter. That the executioner's assistant became known as the photographer for his gesture of fastening the lunette, then stepping aside, recalling portrait makers on the street. That legend sympathique says that the chemist Lavoisier, in an experiment, agreed to blink for as long as he could after the blade fell. That the surgeon, Joseph Guillotin, who did not invent it, was an advocate for methods faster than wheel breaking or being drawn and quartered. That before it became standard, the rich could pay for a faster execution. That gallows humor like La Lunette Républicaine, the Republic's toilet seat, recalled a collective aperture, lever, riddance. That by the turn of the century, capital punishments in France took place at twilight, the minimum legal amount of light to limit documentation by camera. That a killing that took no time could be repeated, could take up time again with film. That the 32 American killing states still forbid the presence of cameras. That in 1988, sound portraits of the execution of 22 inmates recorded by the Georgia Department of Corrections were used to challenge the notion of instant death by electric shock. That to be an American is to be able to name a last meal, to sit unseeing in an audience the nation state's shudder implies. That the last French blade fell in 1977. That it ran longest in the colonies. That the last executioner said the whole thing would happen like in a fast film. That the first film of the guillotine, made in secret, prompted calls for terminating its use. That Lavoisier blinked, blinked, blinked. Um, I meant to say this before, but all of the sounds in that piece are made by vintage cameras. And yes, yeah, I think there's a different experience when you learn that prior or after. Um, and I wonder if one is more useful than the other, one method. You can tell me later if you have a thought about that. But yeah, every sound is made by a camera, especially the old flash bulbs that kind of like spackle at the end and can sound a little like gore. I'm gonna end by reading, I think it's a couple short sections, 6 short sections from this new book that I'm working on. And all of the works that I've published so far have included images of some kind, visuals of some kind. So they challenge the reader to look and read at the same time. And this new book, Carousel, is a book that is describing a lot of images, real images from the history of art, but the book actually does not include or depict any of those images. And I've been thinking about what it will be like to read from this book aloud versus ask someone to read it themselves and have the time to imagine. And what I'm going to try today is my first attempt at performing a section of that new work while presenting some images to you, just as an experiment. So this is a book that takes the form of a lecture given by a professor who is kind of consistently being derailed and addressing side topics during the lecture. And the section I'm going to read starts in kind of the second movement of that lecture when the professor is still lecturing on Zoom during lockdown, but the images have gotten kind of scattered in their lineup. So I'll read just 6 short sections from this project. Thanks again for having me. This is from Carousel. Among the fine arts students, something is lately missing. The painting majors are lectured with images on the first floor of the school. Then they walk upstairs to paint portraits that repeat a peculiar lack. They're only halfway through the Renaissance, and the whole class has been struck with headlessness. Their professor hopes it's a rejection of history. Artists should study other artists, she agrees, but all of her students paint portraits from the neck down using handheld mirrors. They sketch whole families sitting light for film photographs. Some sit the human head on a nightstand. Some add rooster or pig heads in their place. One paints a delicate patch of light, a halo with a nose, and from the back of the room there is only tender vibrations where the figure's head should be. In every other sense, their work is distinct. They swear they've arrived at headlessness independently. But the professor is their teacher. She watches them back. They have all seen the movie, sure, out this year, where in the first act a girl's head is lopped by a telephone pole, and in the last, the dead girl's mother saws her own head off with a piano wire. In her classroom, on the big screen, the professor projects an image of Les Fauves, who excommunicated Magritte from surrealism wearing animal masks. The classroom is cold, but as the screen heats up, the faces in the front row will start drooping. Among Magritte's most imitated tropes, she tells them, was the visage replaced by the apple. Faces obscured across decades of his work became a feature associated with the anti-logic of surrealism. But what is it about headlessness now? She asks them. What do you want to show your audience? The students in the back raise their hands, tell her about Ned Stark, whose son's head was replaced by his dog's head sewn on. One remembers talking heads, and the woman writes it on the board to keep them looking. On the screen, she projects Marinari's graying John the Baptist, Gentileschi's Judith and Holofernes, and Dante's Bertrand de Born. Video game bosses slain by the neck, a student offers, fall into a category called DR, decapitation required. Another mentions a children's story, Girl with the Green Ribbon. The professor is at the keys, projecting Saints Valerie and Milieu, Victorious and Gentian. The heat of the screen has spread now to the center of the room. Alas, poor Yorick, the professor cries excitedly. Do we think a skull is a head? But she's losing them. Decollation severs a figure from its context, she explains faster as the boss fight student yawns. It is the artist's opportunity to meet or dodge the gaze. Formally, a headless figure displaces the Western focal point, turns the view around. What the professor's students won't say to each other is that they're tired of being recognized. For them, there has only been the persona, the self lived in parallel, bifurcated, why not at the neck? They are forever trying to look behind their own shoulder, the shoulder behind that one, the one behind that. But their professor sweats, lining up images as her front row starts to nod. The lecture blazes on. St. Catherine of Siena, the first balloon, the last guillotine, Ichabod Crane, the punctum, the drone, the line, always the tapestry. In July 1865, a letter to the editor of the Ulster Observer, John Henry Ronge, recounted being dragged, pummeled, and tossed continuously like peas in a child's rattle in the basket of a runaway balloon named Research. It was nearly afternoon on July 3rd, the professor tells them, when Runge found himself alone in the basket after being trampled by his fellow passengers, who had ignored the aeronaut Henry Coxwell's instructions during landing, ripped the valve cord off the envelope in panic, and jumped from the balloon's floating car. The rapid change in weight left Ronge sailing alone at house height across the open field, dragging behind him a grappling hook at the end of a 40-foot line. The drawn anchor exploded tree limbs, tossed boulders about like feathers as Ronge, moving at 15 miles an hour, called out to passing farmers, begging them to tie him down as the balloon approached the open sea. For God's sake, he required, help me or I shall be lost. Secure the anchor. Some in the countryside ran from fear at the sight of the silk balloon. One man fell flat on his face in terror, and several groups tried to tie the basket to nearby trees. But the balloon escaped them or tore itself loose each time, eventually rending the rope from the car. The Research scraped chimneys from the roofs of farmhouses, toppled stone fences, and bludgeoned Runge against the side of a mountain before he flung himself overboard into a hawthorn hedge and survived. 2 days later, the Research was found beached on the Scottish shoreline containing a copy of Northern Wig, 4 top hats, 2 coats, filled with sand. A decade later and an ocean away, the Times reported a great year for finding things. including the skeletons of aeronauts found bleached after being exposed to the elements in the baskets of escaped balloons in Egypt, Iceland, and Newaygo County, Michigan. One student's mother is calling on FaceTime in his pocket. The stuttering phone waves to her, pans the camera around the room, then hangs up without speaking. Nothing stops. In 2020, Zoom developers introduced a feature called Hide Self View, a tool that removed the viewer's access to their own image while still displaying it live. Self View was originally designed to ensure that users were projecting clear images of themselves. But Hide Self View was developed in response to the growing proprioceptive discomfort expressed by users who found themselves, more often than not, thinking about and watching their own face instead of concentrating on those they were speaking to on screen. In 2019, FaceTime took a different approach by building in FaceTime Attention Corrector, a feature that altered the pupils of users through ARKit, a tool that maps a user's facial features, then warps their eye so that it appears to the other person like the user is making eye contact. Using FAC, two people staring into their own faces on a video call will not notice that their paired reflections are looking eye to eye. From the third floor of the Wellness Center, the professor is watching the new art museum go up. Attached to the treadmill is a 2 by 3 foot screen that has no off button. As the screen counts the minutes, it rolls POV video of scenic trails and wooden paths beneath the italicized brand name, a title. Though the locations change, the video effect is so continuous that the professor can't recall how it switches locations. Does the change happen through a slow image overlay? Has there ever been a sliver of black screen between? She really can't say. Often she feels a twinge in her knee. Then it is Bremen, Toronto, Geneva again on a loop that she has come to know so well, she recognizes the bystanders who were there when the camera pedaled by. On an unnamed beach, a father shuffles his toddler out of the way, glaring softly. In Tampa, a runner waves his palm up close to the lens. The woman is comforted by the couple looking back in surprise before the viewfinder passes in Iceland, leaving them to trail snacks and oblivion. Mostly the woman feels the footage instead of watching it. Outside, the art museum goes up slowly, black brick by plate glass by concrete stairs. A friend who works there says that inside they are building a light well, a pillar of glass where snow can fall and light can diffuse, but neither can strike the art. Behind the women, behind the gym, is a cylindrical tower, a steam release that points at the sun. All day and night, its furrowed shadows lap at the museum's northern wall. Beyond that wall is a windowless, temperature-controlled room that drops below zero if her friend pushes a button, where Ana Mendietta's silhouettes are housed, and where curators recently opened a box containing an Eva Hesse piece made of polyester resin and found only sledge. The very moment a photograph is made, her friend says, it begins to vanish. Next, the professor flies backward off the treadmill. She steps on the plastic rim, goes down on one knee, and shoots back like a star. She is not the oldest person in the wellness center, but now she has fallen in front of the undergraduates. The young runners keep treading politely, footage, sweat, and rubber. They look away. The woman gets up. She had taken a step sideways before the belt zipped her airborne and turned itself off. A man in a hat had arrived on screen. A figure in the reel came close, and the woman dodged him. The video program had updated. The footage changed, and she fell. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
That was wonderful, Sarah. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So we are going to have time for a Q&A. Let me add Ariel to the spotlight here. Let's see. What did I do? I tried to get all of us here. Add. And there we go. Okay. Um, so again, if you all in the audience have any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat and I'll ask them on your behalf. And Sarah or Ariel, if you have questions for one another, um, that's great too. I'm I'm so taken by how you both explore histories. That's one thing, and in different ways, the personal history, and then the kind of more cultural history or the a type of collective artifact, maybe Sarah, in your work. Although there is the kind of the personal history as well, and that's one thing that I want to talk to you both about, or the what 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 draws you to histories and more specifically in the way that you explore them, the form that you choose. I know with Ariel, one of the questions I had early on was like, were you always writing about your personal history through poetry, or were you writing poetry and exploring a different type of subject matter? How did that come about? And then I had a question too with you, Sarah, at some point about like integrating these other visual elements and how that might have changed how you explore those stories. So those are some things I was thinking about as you all were reading and making some connection.
Sure. I'm not quite sure how to answer that. I think that's always been there's a big distinction for me with when I started taking my poetry writing seriously. Kind of when I was in undergrad, I was just sort of trying to figure out how to write a poem, and I think that I was scared to engage with anything that felt really important. So I was just sort of, not that they were nothing, but it was like an ode to my favorite pair of shoes, or just like a vague poem with the ocean as a metaphor. And once I started really paying more attention and trying to take it seriously, um, I just kind of found myself writing in that kind of direction. Poetry has always been a kind of sense making space for me, and I think the origin of that is trying to make sense of myself. So in a very literal way, I was like, well, where do I come from? Those kind of working backwards. So um, it's kind of frustrating because it's frustrating and interesting because it's sort of writing about the same things over and over again, but then there's just kind of more and more that you find. You're kind of it's like being an archaeologist for yourself, and you just have to like dig into your own past, and that means my parents' past and their grandparents' past and the countries and cultures that they come from, and it's this weird I don't know. When I was first writing, people would call it self-mythologizing, which feels too big. I think mythology is kind of too large for it. I think lore is the more appropriate word. It's kind of like self-lore, but it creates this little weird world that interconnects all of my poems. But the point of interest is always like the self, I think, and so I'm able to get to these different sorts of histories and avenues and points. But the I don't know if that's a good thing to say, but I guess the self is always the nexus. It's always coming out of like, why am I like this? Let me see if I can trace it back somehow. I don't know if that makes any kind of sense.
It makes a lot of sense too, and I can see the way that self is accumulating as well with the Chili's poem as well. These kind of new experiences of place and history and self, and how you may not have to go back too far to kind of find that intersection or something. Um, Sarah, thank you, Ariel.
Yeah, thanks, Ariel. So many good questions. I'm going to try to like kind of just continue with what Ariel is talking about. I'm thinking about how I write nonfiction. I write essays, I think is what I prefer to say. And those do always include the personal or the singular I and the subjective look. And I think as I've moved through that genre and I've been lucky to approach a couple different projects, I've gotten more interested in the self as just one piece of evidence among other examples of research that serve to support like a guiding idea or insight. So, like the self is just one of the still images that I'm gesturing to as I'm making an argument about seeing or about histories of technology, and that is how I've sort of continued to be interested in the self as like a useful implement for essaying, as well as a guiding voice, right? Like a person who's with you, someone who you're willing to follow along with. And yeah, I think my writing process always does start with research, and I actually like start writing a draft in the document where I have all my research notes, that's first just made of like pull quotes and facts, things that I'm like really lit up about. And I think that a lot of the work, the creative work I make is motivated by that like feeling of awe that I experience when I'm engaged in research, like these impossible facts that I find out or these connections that I realize are obvious if you're someone who has the time to be like super enmeshed in a specific research field. And I think I don't have that time. I'm not able to do it for all of the things I'd like to know about. And so I like to think of these creative genres as moments when you can kind of highlight those connections without having to read, everyone has to read the same book. And I like one prompt that I had for myself when working on this new book was that I had learned that when one of the first hot air balloons was launched in Britain, it was too slow. It failed to launch, and the huge crowd there responded by burning it. But they were so upset that they burned the balloon, and I was like, "What? Like, what does that mean? Like, why would they do that?" And so a prompt I made for myself was to like write the scene of that happening in a way that could explain what the audience was feeling and what would motivate them to burn a hot air balloon that they were so mad that it didn't lift off that they burned it. And I did like I had to learn so much through that process about like what was going on in the town and like what histories of vision were informing that moment when folks expected to have the privilege of seeing something fly. And I think I think one of the projects is always like how to keep yourself writing because we need to write. It fuels like my all sorts of forms of happiness and self-identity, but sometimes I do need a kind of mechanism to get myself into that mode. So that's how research serves me, at least.
No, that's great. I think about like the way that things change change form, or the way that they, have to change form because of a new context that they're placed in. Ariel, you do a lot of translation work, right? And so this idea of what do you all what are some of the markers that are going through your head? I know it's different perhaps from translating just researched, not, I don't want to say stale by any means, but kind of formalist research prose into that state of like an essay that has some lyricism to it, that has maybe more imagery, things like that. And then Ariel, same thing with when you're working with translation, what are maybe some of those markers that um, that you kind of have to retain or keep as a vitality, and what are the things that you then fold into the work? And I know it's probably different for every project, but yeah, those are a couple questions I had as well.
Oh, whoops. Sorry. That's a good question. I'm not quite sure because they're all quite different. And even on like the language level, I've translated poetry from quite a few different Spanish speaking countries, and just like they write in different kinds of Spanishes, So there's words that are exclusive. The most recent one is a book by a Chilean poet named Christian Gomez Olivares, um, who lives in the U.S. now. Actually, he teaches somewhere in Ohio.
You're freezing up a little bit. You got garbled there for a second. Uh-oh, we lost you.
Different from the Caribbean, like the language level. I've had to do. Oh, I don't remember what I was saying. Just sorry. Am I still here?
You
Oh,
froze
well.
up for a little bit. You got into a glitch.
Oh, am I back though?
I think you're back now. Yeah. So
Okay, sorry about that.
no, 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 no. You said there was a poet that you had recently translated, and that's where it started to go blah, blah, blah. I couldn't hear it.
Oh, sorry.
What was that
Yeah,
poet? Who was that poet?
Christian Gomez Olivares. He's a Chilean poet. He lives in Ohio now. But that was just to say that I had to do. There's and his book was about called The Burning of the Reichstag, which was, I might be mispronouncing that, but it was essentially like a false flag operation that the early Nazi government did. They basically burned down a government building and blamed it on the Jewish population. Um, so there was like that kind of historical research. Even though he had already done the research, I had to like find the equivalent sort of language for it in English. But then just some of his language being such a different Spanish that I'm used to, I had to like it's not just looking up the definition of a word, but like the usage in that country in particular. It's been like that with working with poetry from the Dominican Republic and Haiti as well, because some of the poets incorporate some of the indigenous language from the Taino people, which doesn't exist much anymore. So that's researching things that there isn't a lot of information about either has been one of the challenges. But one of the upsides is translating living poets. So I've had a few projects. A recent one, a great poet named Mateo Morrison from the Dominican Republic, and he's a great anthologist as well. So he's very familiar with like a lot of the history of the Dominican Republic and the work. Some of the other poets that I've translated, who passed years ago, but he was friends with them and he helped kind of keep their work alive over there. So I was able to access him for those sorts of things. But it's fun. It can be frustrating, but it's just like I guess with translation, you don't always know what you need to research. You just kind of like encounter it as you go, and you're like, well, I don't even know if there is information on this thing. But I enjoy it a lot. I don't know if that quite answers the question, but
No, no, it
it,
absolutely does. I mean, it was
yeah.
kind of it was a very broad question and probably, way too broad. I was just thinking also what you just said, this idea of like, well, if you got someone who's alive and you can ask them and you can work with them, how that becomes, I don't know, more, is it less of a, no, not less of a collaboration, but it's a different type of collaboration than if you're just working through the research. And do you find in if you're translating someone who's both living or versus dead that you become less of a focal point in one or the other? Like, do you decrease more in one, or does it? I guess I'm just trying to get into these feeling states of what it feels like. Does it feel any differently when you're translating someone who can't speak back or answer your questions versus someone who can?
Yeah, it's a little I don't want to take up too much time, but it's a little less daunting. I think when they're dead, then I don't, I'm like they're not going to say anything. I won't go any near any Ouija boards and mediums and so they can't they can't comment back. But I don't think of it as collaboration and I've had my poems translated into Spanish as well. I think of it very literally of the poets living that just makes the research easier. Like asking them versus like being on the internet, the end result is the same thing if I can get the information. So having the living person, and I like to translate people who haven't been in English before, so they tend to be typically like excited. They're like, "Oh, this is great," and they're just like, "Whatever you want to do is cool." And the people that I've worked with have been great. They're not like overbearing, and they don't. They don't try to like take control of it. So it's been a largely positive process for me with translating living poets. But it just makes the research aspect of it easier. It sounds kind of goofy to call it research, but that's how I think of it. It's just like whatever way I can get this question answered if they're alive, it's a lot easier.
Absolutely, absolutely. Sarah, how does my kind of obtuse question sit with you?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about like the complete marvel of translation, which I know about solely through being married to a translator. And just the notion that you that the best translators are the best writers. And it shocked me to learn at one point that the best translators are not necessarily native speakers of the language they're translating from, but they're incredible readers and writers. That's like the tool you need. So I always love hearing about that. And I love your question and yeah, about or your answer about Ouija boards and maybe not using them or using them. Um, yeah, I'm thinking, well, I think we both read pieces that were informed by headlines or like newspaper pieces, and I'm thinking about yeah, how translation relates to research or moving um, news style or academic language into lyricism or image, and how those modes of translation might actually, of course, provide points of access to that information that are different, but also possibly illuminate something about them or reveal a truth that those other modes of rhetoric don't actually allow us to have access to. And I think that's something that really excites me about working with research, about about reading like insanely long academic PDFs that I'm like highlighting for the sound of their words. That's something I'm doing. And yeah, I think in this new book, I'm still like, I think it's not finished. I have my edits due in 2 weeks, and I'm still struggling with what it's going to mean to perform it aloud because I think it is ekphrastic, but I also kind of hate the idea of ekphrasis, like writing that responds to images, when I think there's so much more that the writing is doing than describing or responding to, and what it means to read alongside or in lieu of images, I think is also maybe related to this question of translation or transmutation or bringing alive something that is only accessible in another form or another modality. So it is something I think I'm constantly doing, or maybe it's like a motivator for my creative practice. But yeah,
No,
I
I
don't
think
know.
it's great. I didn't feel like, and that's, yeah, we talk about ekphrasis in my classes too, and it's not merely just describing like the with mimesis, or this is accurate description of what you see and just tagging all the information. It's also the kind of tunneling beneath the the surface of that image, and I thought you did that really well. I will say I have a vote here on whether or not you say it's vintage cameras before or
Oh yeah.
after.
Yeah, I want to know.
After.
Really? Okay, wow.
Yeah, I'm voting for after just because it sounded like almost it sounded like blades, like
Yeah.
and I like that it moves from the literal to, this camera thing. So I like that because maybe I wouldn't hear that same thing as much. I don't know. That's my vote.
Yeah, you're right. You hear the turn differently when you don't know beforehand. There's kind of
Yeah. I don't know, Ariel, if you got to vote, if the audience has votes, maybe we can take a informal poll here. Uh,
No, I agree because it's intriguing and it's not, but like not distracting. So you're like, it kind of, yeah, it has like a physical reaction to it as well, where you're like, I don't know. And then you do tell us at the end, so we are rewarded yeah. I think yeah, it works.
thanks. That's re actually really interesting to me. I think I mostly worry about exposing an audience to hearing something other than what they think they're hearing, and like the potential violence of that. But maybe there's a relief with the aftermath of, yeah.
yeah.
Thanks.
And I meant to say one more thing too. We had a student. So at the end of the semester show in the fall, there's this big production in the middle of campus of a beheading with a ceramic. So there was a guillotine that was up. There was a ceramic head that was in the likeness of one of the students who wore this amazing dress, and the students does a lot of performance. It was pretty spectacular. Um, so anyway, that got me thinking. Um,
Wow. Wow.
yeah. Oh yeah, Skylar Parker. It was sculpture major. Thank you. Um, so, any other questions that you all have for either one another, or I'll give, the audience one last chance here to put something um, into the chat.
I just want to say I love the visual component was really really cool. The lunettes, yeah, I thought it was awesome. I loved it.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, I'm doing a lot of experiments, so thanks for being with me through them. Um, Ariel, I wonder, could you tell me and everyone else, what do you do when you have a new book out and you're reading from it for the first time? Like, how do you think about what to share when you have kind of limited window and not a lot of time for context. Like, do you always read the beginning or do you like to do like a smattering or what do you do?
Oh yeah, this might not be a useful answer because I'm kind of a maniac with like getting work out in the world. So by the time the book is out, I've done and Jordan and I were talking about this just before the reading started about like having a hard time saying no to things. You know, people ask me to like do readings and stuff, and I just always say yes, and then I forget I agreed to it. So it's just kind of a long-winded way of saying by the time the book is out, I'm almost like I don't want to say bored, but I've read from, I've been reading from it for a while. So by the time it is
Yeah.
out in the world, I kind of know the pieces that are working. And I
Yeah.
kind of almost want to start reading like newer stuff.
Yes.
Uh,
Yes.
but yeah, but I do enough readings to where at early on I get to test out like, I have an idea. I think this poem will read well. I think this will hit. But by the time the book is out and I'm doing readings for the book, it's pretty much like I kind of know what to choose from. And it's really just a matter of if I have 10 minutes, I know which three poems I'll read. If I have 10, 15, if they give me half an hour, then it, I get enough opportunity to work it out in real time by the time the thing is in the world. I don't know if that's actually useful, but that's
Yeah.
kind of how it's been for me.
I like that your answer is sort of just like practice, which is not the answer I want, which is really helpful. This is my third book that's going to come out and it's yeah, it's like almost finished and I'm already excited to read like work that's like half finished. It feels like
Yeah,
the problem of the writer. And maybe, maybe the
yeah.
other as well. Mhm.
Well, I think one of the greatest things about reading new work is you can kind of edit in a real time that you may not, you have a sensitivity that you don't. I mean, I read my poems all the time to myself, but then I get in front of an audience and something kind of changes with my aperture, where I'll hear something, a phrase that I thought I'd gotten the burrs out of, and I'll be like, oh, Lord. And there's something that it's almost like a psychedelic experience where
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
reattunes my ears. Does that happen to you all too? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I've seen Adrian Matika, who's really wonderful. I've seen him like he'll have a like a pencil in hand. And I've seen him like make edits. Like he finished the poem and he's like that, cross something out or change something in like the book itself too, which is kind of crazy because that's already a thing. But yeah, I've seen him do that also, and it was kind of awesome. I think I was a bit younger when I saw it, and I was like, oh, you can do that. You can just make the changes in real time. That's kind of cool.
Yeah, I feel like I'm always trying to talk to my students about readings as a tool for revision because they have been so much that. Like, I sent my first book out for many, many years and I was always reading from it. And every time I would be, I love that idea of the burr. Like, you feel the burr in a sentence when you're performing it that you wouldn't at your desk because you're like, I love this sentence. I've read it so many times. But it's so useful. And I think I was thinking about reading old work for today, and then I was like, no, I should read this new book because I'm trying to edit it. And there were things when I was like practicing beforehand, I was like, oh no, too formal, right? Like all these little things you realize. So I think it's such a great tool, even though it's kind of a painful one because you're doing it for others.
Oh,
You have to,
right. Yeah. But yeah, it's the painful aspect is maybe required. We got one more, let's take one more question. And it's along the lines of editing. So do either of you get the feeling you aren't done with a piece, like it needs more writing or editing? And if so, how do you get to the point where you feel like it's done, and then part of that is how do you not maybe over edit as well? Because I think that can happen as well. So what is it, maybe a little bit more about your editing process and how do you know or feel like a piece is either in air quotes done or in, headstone done?
Uh, Geez, I'll try to be brief. Again, this might be useless. But when I was in graduate school, that's what I used workshop for. I would, different people had different approaches, but my approach was I'm gonna, I'd be working on multiple poems and like I would pick one and I'd be like, I'll work on this one this week and I'll try to get it as good as I can. And so I used workshop to see if I had correctly assessed the poem, right? I think I wrote a good poem. I'm going to bring it to workshop. Let's see if that's true. Because I went to graduate school at the same school I went to undergrad. And so I had friends who went through the program and I had seen some people finish grad school and then say, what do I do now? Like, I don't know how to write without the regiment, without like the workshop space. And I was like, that can't be me. I can't have that. So, it functions as a kind of evidence. I finished grad school, and over the 3 years, not that every poem was a hit, but I had kind of I had evidence to suggest that I had figured out when I knew that I had written a good poem. There isn't anything in particular. It's just kind of a feeling at this point. But I've learned to trust that feeling because I did that. I would put it up and if it went well, maybe a couple line edits, cut this word or move this thing around. But like the poem had accomplished what I had hoped it would. And that was the function. That was a big function of grad school for me, was just teaching myself to over 3 years to know when I did that and believe it because it just kept happening over and over again. And if the poem didn't go well, that just meant I got good feedback on it and I could figure out how to improve it and make it better. So I just kind of trained myself to do that over a few years. But there isn't like a particular thing really. Also, being meticulous about sending work out to magazines and being ambitious. So, if I was sending poems to the New Yorker and Poetry Magazine before I had anything published, and it was like, if it sucks, they're not going to take it, and just expanded that list of the magazines, say, well, these are the places I want to be, and these are where my favorite poets are, and my teachers are. So if it gets published there, that's got to mean something. That's not always the best way. You don't want to put too much weight on that. But that was something that I did when I was younger as well.
No, I think it's really important. I mean, sometimes just sending something out and seeing it in print, again, it makes you a better editor of your work because then you say to yourself, "Oh no, oh no, why did I leave
Yeah.
it in there?" Or it gets rejected 20 or 30 times, and you say, "Oh, maybe it is me. Maybe it
Yeah,
is
and you
me."
look at it
Right?
different too when
True.
you're
Yeah.
gonna send it to a magazine and you're like, let me look it over again. And sometimes I'm like, actually,
Right. Right.
maybe I
Actually,
won't send this to that editor. This is looking like a no. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
that's great. Sarah, how about with you when it comes to editing and doneness?
Yeah, just like really briefly, I like the way that this question is phrased, like in terms of the feeling you get, the feeling you have that you aren't done with a piece. Like I think I'm speaking for myself, but I sense that I'm speaking for a lot of writers where like that actually isn't a feeling that I'm like familiar with that often. And it's a feeling that actually like I tend to want to be done. I tend to feel good about a first draft. Like I remember the writer Abigail Thomas being interviewed and she's written like 12 books and the interviewer was like, what's your favorite book that you've written? Like, what's something you'd like to talk about? And she was like, well, the favorite book is always the one you've just written. It's always the new work. And I think there's that's very true for me. And there's something to that is that the newest work you always feel like is done because you haven't had time to kind of look over your shoulder, see it published, read it aloud, and kind of find those burrs that we're talking about. And I think the challenge and sort of like the thing I'd like to rise to do better as a writer going forward is to develop a better tolerance for the feeling that I'm not done, for coming upon reasons to feel like I'm not done with a piece and occasions to return to it. And I think that workshop has been a really good opportunity like that for me, the sort of like exposure that that offers. Readings as we're talking through do that for me, but I really think time is the best time. And no writer wants to hear that, right? Like you finished a piece, put it in a drawer for a year. Like that's how you'll come back to it and feel like realize you're not done. And that's not very immediately rewarding. And there's so few immediate rewards in arts practice. But I think that has been a marker of what it means to really like honor the work you're making and decide that you're willing to go back to it or that it might not be done even though it's your favorite, even though it feels the best at this moment. Yeah, so and I think that's like that's something I probably heard as a writer for many years in my life and was always like, no. Like I'm not gonna go back to it or why, it feels done. I want to move on to another project. But I think it is something I'm trying to work with myself on and also talk to my students about.
That's great. This was wonderful. I thank you so much for being so generous and being here and for spending some time answering some questions about craft. Um, I just want to say to everyone that the next reading will be April 5th with Suzanne Frischkorn and Elise Knorr. It'll be at 3 p.m. Central Standard Time. You'll see uh, me publicizing it all over Instagram, and it should post at the KCAI website. But you can always look at my website as well because that's where you can register for the event. So I hope to see some of you all back there. Thanks again to our readers, Ariel and Sarah. Have a wonderful rest of your weekend. I love having this series at this time because then I can go back out into the world and be kind of charged with poetry instead of wanting to go to bed, since I go to bed pretty early these days. So anyway, thank you, everybody. Have a great evening. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.